Gosh, I got so excited talking about the different models of parenting that I didn't realize my video cut off. So, where I ended on video 4, and welcome to video 5, which is the final video in this week's series, we were talking about traditional, independent, separate, and mixed, which is a combination of the three above, typically where the people, the partners in the relationship, don't see themselves as the same, whether it's traditional, independent, or separate. So mixed is a variation of that. So when we talk about communication and parenting and how all this works, there's the idea that, again, you become other oriented, right? That you have this idea that you're trying to understand where the other person is coming from and what you need to do to improve anytime that there are problems in a relationship. And a family relationship is even more important because these are your family members. Not to say that it's more important than other relationships, but I would say that, your family is the unit that you were brought into, and to a degree, they are important to you, whether you have a relationship with them or not. So the book does a good idea of first recognizing the fact that a lot of problems in family relationships boils down to communication. So, ways in which we improve those relationships is that we try to, as much as we can, improve communication. And the book does a really nice job of doing an overview of where they talk about what is considered good communication ideals and clear expectations of a good communication system. And it mentions things like being open and being attentive and understanding the role of emotion and affection, to be polite but yet be disciplined, to have humor but yet be serious when it needs to be, and how to have a routine of constant communication. Then they go even further and say that there's 8 qualities that functional families actually exhibit, which is really interesting. The first one is that there are interactions that are patterned and understood. So they are established and there is shared meaning when it comes to their interactions. There's compassion that prevails over cruelty in their communication. Problems are addressed to the person who created them, and other families are not scapegoated. 4, families exercise self-restraint when it's necessary. 5, boundaries about safe territories and roles are made clear. And sometimes they are made clear by passing those boundaries, but typically then once you realize there's the expectation of a boundary, that is respected. Number 6, it includes a life that is joyous and humorous. The next one is misperceptions are minimal. And then the last one, number 8, is positive interactions outweigh the negative ones. So that's kind of interesting, right? How we take that and move it into an overarching idea of improving family relationships overall. We do that a couple different ways. You take time to communicate with your family. So number 1 in front of you, you take time to talk. You also, and just as importantly, you take time to listen to the person or your family members. 3, you clarify any messages or meanings that are misunderstood or misperceived. Because a lot of times when there is miscommunication or an error in perception, if you don't address it, that is where the conflict arises from. And if you don't address the conflict that arises from the misunderstanding, it just starts to roll downhill like a snowball that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then to a point where it's out of control, and you sometimes get to the point where you can't control it. It's gone too far. So clarify anytime there are misunderstandings of messages and misunderstanding of meanings of messages. You're always there to support and encourage each other. And you again do this through action. You do this through your words. You do this by showing up right when you need to. You send that note, you make that phone call, you make that connection, you tell somebody that you support them, you encourage them with your words. However you choose to do that, you support and encourage. And then the 5th one is that you manage conflict and you manage stress. So anytime that comes up, you are able to handle it through communication, through understanding that there are expectations that have been violated, through having that conversation, fixing it, and then respecting the new set of boundaries that were set. I know this is difficult. I know family communication sometimes can be an even deeper level of hurt when things don't go your way, and even more joyous level of happiness when they do go your way. So I certainly understand that sometimes this is hard to do, but I can't stress enough that it's important work because these are your family members. And again, you get to self-define family. So whoever you value important enough to label family in your life, these are the 5 things that you want to do to make sure that you have solid, good family relationships. Moving on to another area of relationships that we have in our lives, and those are our workplace relationships. So sometimes we are so close to our family, or I'm sorry, so close to our work coworkers that we could call them family, and in a way you could define them as family, but we know that there are definitely unique challenges and unique relationships when it comes to people that you have to interact with on a daily basis based on a role that you play of somebody that gets paid to perform a certain task at the job in which you work at. So it's interesting, the different types of work relationships that we have. There are definitely value in them, and there's definitely some disadvantages to having work relationships. Let's talk about first the value of relationships. Obviously, when you have strong relationships at work, the information exchange is strong. The communication, the ability to work together, the ability to communicate on a much broader level and a much deeper level is there. The social support, just interacting with these people that you see all the time, right? We see sometimes our coworkers more than we see our friends and family at different points in our life. So to have that support there on a consistent daily basis is very important. There's also improved performance when we get along and have strong relationships. We want to do well for people that we get along with really well. So there's definitely a correlation between strong, good communication and work relationships to the output of performance. There's a sense of identity that you have when you have good work relationships. And then you also typically stay with the company and to a point almost do well enough to either get promoted or get more job responsibilities because you feel invested with these people when you show up every day and respect the people that you're around. The disadvantages, the list is a little shorter, but they're there and they're very important. The disadvantages include termination. So what happens when somebody loses their job? What happens when you don't have these people in your life anymore? You saw them consistently for 5 days a week, for 8 to 10 hours a day, and then they're gone, right? And think about the things that come along with termination. If you respect somebody and you do really well around them, and you have good, strong communication, but they maybe might not be getting along with your employer. So they're having issues with the company, but your relationship with them is strong. So there's a lot of different levels that can make something very delicate when there's termination involved. Authority changes. A lot of times you will have a situation where the leader of the unit that you work for can absolutely influence and dictate the communication and the relationships you have. And when that changes, for good or for bad, it will definitely change the dynamic of the relationships. I've personally worked in an environment where a boss absolutely welcomed open communication and we all saw each other outside of work, and we had happy hours. We went out and celebrated almost every holiday together. Anytime there was conflict, she addressed it and she made sure that she told you the importance of addressing your issues, and so that all made us stronger. She left as my boss. She left the organization altogether. New boss comes in, and she is very much about coworkers only being coworkers. Relationships outside of work were not allowed. So we didn't talk about them. So we felt like we were being secretive in a way. And she thought that anything that was personal didn't belong at work. So even if we wanted to ask nice follow-up questions like, how was your son's soccer game this weekend? She didn't want any part of it. She didn't want us talking about it. So it was definitely a change for sure. And it made things very uncomfortable. And I think some people lost relationships because of that. So that was very difficult. And then fallouts, if you have fallouts, relationships with anybody, you have a situation that comes up that you cannot come back from, that will change the communication dynamic for sure. And it will change, you you feel uncomfortable about somebody, and then all of a sudden you got to work with them 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, see them more than you see your family and friends, and you have issues with them, you have a fallout with them, it's going to become difficult. One thing that the book addresses that I think is very interesting is this idea of workplace romance. So it's kind of taking what we talked about in the previous chapter and brings it into the workplace. So, a couple things that is important to recognize and mention when we talk about anytime you get into a romantic relationship with your coworkers is that you first and foremost want to be professional. You certainly do not want to take advantage of the situation because of the fact that you work together, especially if it's a subordinate relationship where you've got somebody who's a boss and then somebody that reports to that person. You want to avoid any sort of conflicts of interest where you put ahead that person's personal gain ahead of the employer or ahead of the company or anything like that, where you're basically making it a very subjective decision because you have a romantic relationship with that person. Like being professional, you also want to make sure that you adhere to company policy, that you make sure that you watch any communication methods in which you might have a situation where things become unprofessional, like you send personal emails or things that are romantic in nature that don't belong in the workplace. Like those are personal emails you want to send, but you don't want to gray those lines where you start sending them from your work email or you start using your work phone for those types of conversations. And also watch your verbals and nonverbals at work, because you can have situations where you will make other people feel uncomfortable because they are not obviously in a romantic relationship, and sometimes they might not want to be around it or be exposed to it, or there's a misunderstanding about it, or they just don't feel that it's appropriate. And so when they have to be subjected to verbals and nonverbals that they feel are inappropriate, it becomes a very difficult conflict to navigate. So, just some things you want to keep in mind should those areas of your life, romantic relationships and workplace relationships, start to overlap with each other. There is definitely some expectations that are set that you are professional and that you avoid things that make people feel uncomfortable or there's conflicts of interest. Make sure you always adhere to company policy. When we talk about communication that you have with your boss, we want to bring up different types of communication that happens in the workplace and show how that happens. Upward communication happens when subordinates are communicating up to their supervisors. Downward communication is when supervisors are communicating to their subordinates. And then you have peer-to-peer, which is horizontal communication when it goes across from one coworker to another. And obviously the types of communication are going to dictate how you communicate. So obviously, upward communication, if you're communicating to your supervisor, you are going to use words that show respect, respect for authority, respect for the position, respect for your position, respect for the company. There's a level of hierarchy in a way that you have to respect when you are communicating with your supervisor. Same thing down, supervisors to subordinates. There's a level of respect that is expected, that supervisors, respect the knowledge of their subordinates. They understand the important role they play in the communication of the office and then the overall role of the employer. And then peer to peer as well. So you want to make sure that you're using appropriate language that shows equal parts respect for the person that you are working with, that you call a coworker. Different types of communication theories here. The Plez effect is when employees will be more satisfied if they feel their supervisor can influence at a higher level. So if you feel like your supervisor is advocating for you to their boss, you will actually be more satisfied because you feel more valued. The leader-member exchange theory says that supervisors develop different types of relationships with different employees, and this is actually a very interesting theory, but it basically says you manage people the way they need to be managed rather than one blanket management style. You actually develop different types of relationships with different employees that will motivate them to interact and have good communication skills and be a good worker based on the type of communication that will, a relationship that will spur them to be better employees. The last thing that we talk about, and you'll see the two things in front of you, is hostile work environment with different employers. So harassment is obviously a condition in which employees feel threatened. And then quid pro quo is the idea of exchange for something. If you do this for me, then I'll do that for you type of thing. Both are considered workplace harassment. Both are illegal, but there's no place for that.